Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special exhibition talk by the artist Dr. Pamela See, Cutting a Fine Figure, Chinese in the Australian Cultural Landscape, held on Zoom today here by the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Darug people, who are the traditional owners of the land, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. We are currently showing the art exhibition, Individual and Universal, The World We Share, featuring 3 highly talented and distinctive artists with Asian immigration backgrounds. One of them is Dr. Pamela See. Pamela is a visual artist who practices a contemporary form of paper cutting. Her paternal grandfather left China in the early 1930s, and her father, in turn, immigrated from Malaysia in the early 1960s to Australia. Pamela was born in Brisbane and grew up in southeast Queensland during the 1980s. Pamela is also a highly educated researcher and a scholar. She holds a Bachelor of Visual Arts and a Doctor of Philosophy in Fine Arts from Queensland College of Art, Griffith University, and a Master of Business and a Master of Education from Queensland University of Technology. We are thrilled and greatly honored to have Dr. Pamela See today to speak about her practice and her research in Chinese Australian migration history. It is really fascinating and inspiring to see her artistic creation in an interrelated relationship with her research and her knowledge in history and in her cultural heritage. This talk is intended to foster dialogue about the role art can play in historically instating communities. The contrast between government-driven and community-led development of culturally specific infrastructure will also be debated. At the end of Pamela's presentation, we will take questions from audiences. So you can prepare and post your questions into Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll pick them up for Pamela to respond at the end of her talk. Now, please welcome Dr. Pamela See to give us her presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Jing Han. And I'd like to also begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from, which is Mianjin, Brisbane. So the Jagera and Turrbal people, elders past, present, and emerging, that is. And we kind of somewhat infamously in the early 20th century were also envied by the rest of Australia for our anti-Chinese league because it was particularly ferocious at the time. I'd also like to thank, in addition to you, Jing, the Sally Belmont, Yanni Liu, and the rest of the staff at Western Sydney University, and also all of you who have come today to attend, give an hour up this afternoon from home to listen to me speak. So that's very generous of you. I'm hoping to, as Jing said, reflect upon my practice and how art can be used to either reflect or reinstate the position of some communities in the Australian cultural landscape. In the 19th century, the Chinese to European ratio in some areas of Australia was actually, sorry, I forgot to share screen, was actually, sorry about this, was actually in the ratio of 10:1, and that particular figure came from northern Tasmania in a tin mining communities. However, this is not how history has actually been recorded. I'm sorry, can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let's try this again.
Yeah, it's coming up. Half of it.
Half of it.
Yeah.
I'm not very good with
No, that's
technology,
great.
I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Great.
That's a little bit better.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely
I
fine.
like to do everything that I can by hand, and a very limited technological intervention. So I'm going to begin today with a bit of a chat about some of the works in the exhibition at the Western Sydney University in Universe and Individual and Universe, the World We Live In. You can see one of the copper works up there. And we're going to then discuss some artworks that show that examine the Chinese community in different contexts around the country. So this is within the galleries sector, within participatory art and also public art. And one of the areas that we're going to touch on is our portraits. So a series of portraits which I developed with the Museum of Chinese and Australian History and the National Portrait Gallery through my PhD. One of the people who have been really generous in coming today is my supervisor, Professor Ross Woodrow, and he shared with me his passion for that form of paper cutting. I have to admit that being Chinese in background, I was quite reluctant initially to investigate it, but I'm so very grateful for being introduced to this medium, which I will elaborate on shortly. So the last image on the right is if you can see that, it's a piece of public artwork as well. So okay, there we go. So beginning with these copper artworks in the exhibition in Parramatta, they were generously funded by the Che Foundation. So they provided some support for the materials, because it is actually quite expensive to work in copper. And they depict a number of alcoholic drink carton designs, which I paper cut, and I embellished them with floral species which have been introduced to Australia and have become invasive. But they originated from all over the world and were brought for medicinal purposes. And the reason I'm beginning with this set of artworks is because I wanted to remind everybody that the introduction of any element to an environment has both positive and negative impacts. And this includes people and our cultures and traditions as well. The actual artwork itself, it was inspired a number, or it was probably about a decade and a half. They had a federal government intervention, and alcohol was prohibited in certain areas in an endeavor to, I guess, address issues with our First Nations people. As I think that we're all familiar with the problems that they're facing at Alice Springs at the moment as well. But at that time, they thought that removing alcohol would be a solution. And one of the reasons that the artwork is being cut from copper, well, there's two main reasons. Firstly, where my mother's family are from, Foshan, they've been cutting copper since the Ming Dynasty. So there's that cultural reference, but also alcoholic, in terms of the beverage, beer, which was most likely to be put into cartons of this form, that was drunk in Mesopotamia. And in that ancient society, they also used copper as drinking vessels, to make drinking vessels. So there's a lot of, I guess, symbolic capital invested into the materials, as well as the shapes, the patterns that I use in my artwork. The way they really beautifully presented at the Western Sydney University. I'm perhaps not so elegant in the way I have to admit do things, and that I kind of saw these artworks strewn along the ground in an installation, and it's really terrible to say, but my ambition is just enormous. Like I'd love to see many of them, because it's such a big problem, I think, within the Australian outback. If any of you have experience of the Northern Territory and northern parts of Australia, you may when you venture into the bush, come across places where people camp, and then you will still find discarded containers like this. So I just, in that way, that I'm hoping to one day that we can Jing has also said that I can do this. I can take the work and represent it somewhere else. Thank you for that, to try to express it in this form. I thought that I'd quickly touch on the symbolism, the symbolic capital paper cutting itself as a medium, even before it's translated into other post-digital media, or just simply the material copper. So in a very simplistic way, I'd sum it up as a media that, as a form of image making that emerged between the 4th and 6th centuries from the agricultural region of the Yellow River, or modern day Xi'an. And by no coincidence, this was also where modern pulp strained paper was said to have been invented in the 2nd century CE. So all over the world where you see paper cutting traditions, they've actually reflected the spread of that substrate. So arguably the technique itself of removing negative space to create a positive image has existed in many forms and been applied to many materials all over the world prior to what we know as paper today. However, I think that this medium in particular, Chinese paper cutting, has certain social validity because of the Communist Party, and in its nascence, I guess, from the early 1940s, they've been embracing it to try to communicate, particularly with the proletariat, but particularly women who had limited literacy skills, and that's written literacy skills. Obviously, their visual literacy was incredibly high. Originally, paper cut forms, cutout forms has had metaphysical applications, ceremonies to do with healing, particularly associated with burial. And for the Chinese also, that they thought that they could attract good luck. But you can see how over time, particularly within China and diaspora communities, they serve a social purpose as a repository of values. In contemporary China, well, I mean, I've been going for the past 2 decades regularly, and I guess this contemporary, in a sense, this is my last trip. This is an image from my last trip there, which was just on, I guess, the eve of the fall of COVID. So really late 2019, I think it was then. It was in 2019 anyway. I'm sorry, I have my dates a little bit confused, but I visited where my mother's family are from, in Guangdong, and I was presented this as an example of Foshan paper cutting. And I mean, on the left, this woman, I'm aware that her father is actually from Shaanxi province, but how they would classify it to be for Shan paper cutting would be that she cuts through many layers with a vertical sort of a blade. And I guess it has the long, elegant lines that are attributed to that tradition. But generally speaking, or strictly speaking, of Foshan paper cutting, you would see it to have a little bit more realism, as you might consider the paper cut on the right side. But what I mean to say is, in talking to this woman's father, and I had to travel to another location, Guangdong, to do so, he simply said that, well, if we're in this area, then that's what it will be. He doesn't want to be, and as many papercutters don't want to be dictated to by tradition, and certainly not by the categories that the government has recognized. And many of these distinct regional styles, there are over 50 of them, have been also listed in UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So it's firmly established, but everything is evolving. So it's coming to one of my images here. It's sort of hard to kind of follow up with these really amazing practitioners from China with one of my own, but so I just want to show you that I borrow some of these traditions and also integrated what Ross introduced to me, which was the syllabate portraiture that was prevalent in the 18th and mid-19th century in Europe and North America. And why this is significant for the stories that I want to tell is because a lot of during that time, well, in the 19th century, that's when a lot of the migration to Australia came from China. And this particular image depicts a Moi pastoral worker. So I'm not sure many of the rest of you also had this misconception that early migration from China in the 19th century, by and large, came from Guangdong province. And a lot of the portraits that I have depicted certainly have, but a Moi that would be in Fujian province, which is where my family are from, my father's family are from. And there was documented in the mid-19th century around 300 that were contracted, and they ended up working as laborers and on farms, laborers on farms as shepherds. Some became cooks. So we're trying to track them at the moment. And in this work I'm actually doing with the North Stradbroke Island Museum at, sorry, you forgive me for how I'm pronouncing this, I'm going to try, but Minjarrabah, the island, which is the First Nations name. So I'm working with staff there, Elizabeth Goey and Tracy Ryan, to try verify visuals, because we have a lot of records in terms of their mission. This museum was built on the grounds of an old asylum, it was not sort of a mental asylum, but the benevolent asylum was where people were taken from the community who couldn't look after themselves, and they were placed out of the sight of the public eye to die, more or less. And it was modeled on the poorhouses in Britain. So many of our pioneers to particularly Queensland ended up here because they didn't, if people who didn't end up having family or financial resources. So certainly a shepherd. I believe this is Ah Chong is his name. So, but there are many Ah Chongs. So we're sort of examining that. And the other thing that I have to point out is in that my life outside of research and being a visual artist, I actually help settle migrants and refugees. And for the last 10 weeks, we have had a group from, well, there are people from a number of areas of the world, but a large number are from China. And over the last 10 weeks, we haven't succeeded in getting all of them to answer the question of what their first name is or what their last name is, what their phone number is, all these sorts of things, incredibly difficult. And I have to admit, this is actually what's created a lot of doubt in my mind about the records, that some of which we're going to be seeing today. It's of great concern to me. Coming back to Parramatta, so this is these are some florals which depict crops that Chinese Australians grew to support their European counterparts in the 19th century. And so I've also integrated them with some endemic flora to Sydney. This is a very Sydney-based artwork, and I'll just show you where I get some of this information from. It's an article from the 19th century about a farmer in botany named Jemmy Allo. And so I've circled some of the crops that he's actually, but there's so many more that I've represented in the show at the Western Sydney University. But I'll also note, if you look on the top left-hand corner, that his soil was quite poor. And one of the things that European settlers did was employ Chinese settlers who hadn't become British citizens normally by way of marriage, to clear and prepare the land so it could be more easily cultivated by them. So, but one of the things that I found through the newspaper reports that I've been examining is that the irrigation has been mentioned time and time again. So the way that they moved water, and initially I thought this might have to do with them sort of digging certain trenches. But then I was really surprised to find that this involved some devices. Like, for instance, if you have a look at this article, it specifies the use of a treadmill. So in the 19th century, we had celestials walking on treadmills, pumping water up through the crops. And more interesting yet, than in the early 20th century, in Warwick, I recently went there too, actually, into this very site where one farmer had built, had used some sort of a steam engine to start to move water from the river onto his crops as well. So this is really, I think, very exciting. At least it is to me, but mind you, information to me. But in Warwick, on my visit there, I'd spoken to somebody at the local museum and then at the council, and they said, oh, no, we didn't have Chinese settlers. We haven't had Chinese settlers here. And remarkably, there's, in fact, if you go through the old newspaper clippings in particular, and also records of domicile at the National Archives, there are quite a lot. So there's a boarding house. There is some evidence of perhaps less sociable behaviors recorded of the Chinese, but many of them had come to Warwick. They'd settled there, or they'd moved on to work in the tin mining in Stanthorpe. So this is sort of getting back to, and I'm hoping to one day address this uneven coverage. This community is, I think, historically underserved. But speaking of technologies, most of this lecture is about the social context behind the artwork, or can be applied to the artwork. But I thought it might interest you for me to talk about one of the I guess media that I use, which is paper effigies. And they emerged in the Tang Dynasty. And before that, they were using clay as well as a substitute for genuine offerings. Around the Tang Dynasty, though, they had an outbreak of grave robbery. But it wasn't only that they thought that they could burn a paper effigy to give an item to their deceased loved ones. This also negated, in terms of it not being a precious item destroyed, but also negated the need for sacrifice. And so if we think of the Tang Dynasty, there are many achievements that have occurred there, but one thing that's been really noted about it are, I don't know about you, but I'm really fascinated with the depiction of horses. So horses are really significant, a symbol, and I'm not so sure in terms of their actual breeding, if there were advances in that, but my understanding is with the Tang that they often burnt an effigy, or they printed, would cut print an image of a horse and then burnt it for the deceased relatives, because it was a form of transportation in the next life. And so why this is important is because by the Song Dynasty, there are literary references to Zhima Shangdian, so paper horse shops. But the paper horse shops, they sold more than paper horses. And certainly today, these shops, they sell a diversity of accessories from new clothes to cars, all made out of paper for the deceased and burnt in Qingming, which is coming up it's in about 2 weeks, isn't it, Jing? Like really soon, we're doing Qingming, and also the Hungry Ghost Festival later in the year. So these are, I mean, they might look pretty, these kind of objects that I'm building, but they have great significance to diaspora communities. And getting back to sort of my lack of understanding of technology, I prefer, sometimes I use photographs if it's something like a body of moving water, but generally I just have a knife, a cutting board, and my paper, and I cut holes more or less in a pattern very slowly. It's slow art. It's a meditative but methodical process. And this is an example of my cutting from life, and wherever possible I do this. And I should mention that the crops that I will be depicting and that I have depicted in Sydney are ones that I've also grown up with, or I'm presently growing on where I live on a property in Sunnybank. And so I noticed also another person who's come is a distinguished researcher, Dr. Hilda McLean. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but she's written quite extensively about not only Chinese settlement, but where I live currently, and its amazing history of Chinese market gardening. So I have to take a step back though, because well, I guess my interest in Chinese history has always been there, and I learned a lot through my PhD, but most recently, in terms of the invisibility of communities, what has been an impetus over the last 2 years is the material that you're seeing up on the screen now. I had gone to the State Library of Queensland asking if they could help me find some names of farmers, of market gardeners that were working in the Brisbane markets. And so I got a response from another researcher, Christina Erling Goldbold, and she pointed out to me that there weren't very many records there, simply because in 1909 they had been banned. And so she sent me on the right this newspaper clipping stating this. But if you were to do a search through newspaper records, then like on the left of the screen, there are very many references in the 19th century to calls for this to happen. And then after this time, as I mentioned before, Queensland became the envy of the nation because our anti-Chinese league succeeded. And which would explain why when we talk about market gardeners, Chinese market gardeners in Queensland, we generally think up north, so Innisfail or Cairns. We don't generally think of Southeast Queensland as a place where a lot of Chinese market gardeners lived and supported the community. So this became of interest to the curators of Rearrange the Art of the Flower at the Museum of Brisbane. This show is also on currently. Some of them that I worked with, they include Christine Clark, Sarah Ellingdale, and Elena Diaz Diansha. I think that's how I pronounce the name. But whilst this exhibition is in Brisbane, the florals actually, and according to Hilda, some of these were also grown, these crops were grown in Brisbane as well. And I've also seen other evidence of it. But the ones that I'd initially started depicting were grown out at Guadamuco country. So that's the Redlands, and then brought by cart they drove, it took them a very long time to get to Brisbane along the road. Even if I drive there, it may take an hour, that journey by road today. And so, and in that area, they had quince, and they had citrus, and then banana as well. So the banana, it's not only of significance to me because I grew up being described as a banana that was Chinese, yellow on the outside, but I think white in the middle is a really terrible colloquial term for us. I find it interesting. But I grew up with bananas growing in my backyard too. In terms of the community, there used to be a lot of bananas grown in Southeast Queensland until Panama disease. It affected the crops greatly. But the reason why a lot of farmers turned to fruit and vegetables instead of maize and sugar was because in the 1880s there was an oversupply of sugar due to the colonies in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, where they were just producing an enormous amount. So the price went down. It was no longer considered viable. So we're all interconnected here, these histories. In terms of the banana crop, once the disease was in place, the Queensland government thought to start I guess, documenting, recording the people that were growing the crop. And it's interesting that it's either people who are really have achieved something that is publicly applauded, or they fall on the other side of the government, the law, or I guess in the middle ground, sort of certificates like this are people that are growing something that they need to monitor, that get documented. The other exception, of course, is when you get married as well. But otherwise, it's quite hard to find, when you think about it, people, particularly living in the late 19th, early 20th century, to identify them, I mean. So this is Wang Xing. You can see crossed out on his certificate there that he was married to a British subject, which probably explains why he was one of the last Chinese farmers, particularly of bananas, to remain in Brisbane at that time. This is in the 1920s. And that image there is taken from a certificate of domicile, I think. Or it could be the other one, which is the an exemption from taking the dictation test after they travel outside of Australia and return. This artwork is also very, very graciously collected by the Museum of Brisbane too. So just to explain the format that I tend to use, I have a floral emblem. In this case, and with many cases of the portraits that I've been creating of Chinese Australians, it's a reg silk cotton tree flower and Bombaxibia to symbolize Canton. And then in addition to the silhouette, there's some sort of a white cutout of what their contribution is, and white because it's nuanced, or perhaps not as well known as it could be. So these artworks are all about reinstating the position, the contribution that Chinese Australians have made historically. The artworks on the left are from a show called So Fine, and that was also curated by Christine Clark and Sarah Anningdown in 2018. And on the right is Wei Hop's portrait, which is in an exhibition at the Museum of Brisbane called Perspectives of Brisbane currently. Oh, and this artwork also, I might just bring it back, responds to the research of Dr. Hilda McLean too, because she was really interested. She's a geologist and archaeologist, and very interested in burials. So she did a talk earlier on, maybe earlier this year, last year perhaps, I'm not sure, but she has done a talk for you before. And so she investigated his life. He had a store in Albert Street in Brisbane, and one of the things that he imported and sold were firecrackers for funerals. So that's what you should be able to see at the bottom of his portrait. This is the Holy Triad Temple at Albion, and he was also a trustee of it. There's another person, I'm not sure if he would be depicted here as well, but he was also a trustee named Chick Tok, and he was a merchant that had a number of stores in the CBD, including at least one on Queen Street. Which brings me to a public artwork. So I think that these public artworks can, in some cases, simply reflect the Chinese population, but in this case, in the case of a couple of them, which I'm going to describe today, it's about reinstating, simply because there's just no other evidence of the Chinese community left from the 19th century. And I'll admit that when I was commissioned this artwork, I actually knew very little about that myself. So, but that's not to say that the urban art projects and the Brisbane City Council who asked me to do it were not aware. So perhaps at that time, this was over 10 years ago. So there's been a recent activation of it by IJAC for a festival called The Curiosity. So you can see there's this European honeybee sort of they work in colonies. So I just thought it was interesting to depict that, how British settlement has facilitated the movement of other communities. Although I will acknowledge that Zhenhe apparently came here first from the Chinese, but they didn't come, and they weren't in the habit of colonizing, I don't believe, in the 19th century. So you'll see a mixture of tea flowers, and Chiktok incidentally had a tea house in an area that we would call Kedron today, I believe, or Kelvin Grove, or one of those areas up northern parts of the city. I live in the south, sorry. And the other thing I have to mention is that if you see those flowers, the poppies, so opium wars, it certainly brought a lot of people. Well, they took them out of China into other areas of the world. They resettled in places like Australia. But we have to remember too, in the 19th century, it was actually licensable product that people could sell, not directly in this location, which is on the corner of Albert and Queen Street, further down Queen Street, I believe. And most certainly there were dens down Albert Street, lower down at Albert Street. Okay. So just so that you can see some documentation from this time. And I hadn't known this at the time of this public artwork, but you can see that a person named Raymond Evans wrote about a riot in the 5th of May, 1888. And it talks about how around 2,000 people at its peak came trying to drive the Chinese community out of Brisbane particularly. So they went down to the Chinese Quarter in Albert Street, and you can see they were sort of smashing glass, they're attacking the boarding houses and so forth. And thankfully they ran out of steam. By the end, they couldn't walk all the way to Albion, which is a few kilometers away. But right in here, that you can see, for instance, that there was this presence of merchants on Queen Street, which I regretfully was quite ignorant of. So from that time, the other piece of information that I found really fascinating was that our present Chinatown in Brisbane was something that the government sought to build between we had a Commonwealth Games and Expo 88 in 1988, and a World Expo, and it was noted that we didn't have a Chinatown, so they decided to construct one. So there's this distinct difference that we're going to have a quick chat about between something that has been driven by the local community and in commerce, and sanctified by the government. And even quite thankfully, though, these public artworks have been commissioned by the government. But that said, a lot of people on the committees we have no Chinese connection to the Chinese community, and so it just sort of looks a bit different. So this artwork was commissioned by the Brisbane City Council, and it was positioned in where the Chinese Quarter was on Albert Street. It's been put into storage because they're excavating that area. They found a lot of Chinese artifacts, but they're also building kind of like extending a subway down there. It's called the Cross River Rail Project. But the sculpture itself, you can see it kind of wraps around. There was an artist named Daniel Templeman who was working for the Brisbane City Council, and he did a lot of sheet metal sculptures. He said to me that we should kind of make it into this lantern. And it fit very well to the brief, because the brief specified that the Frogs Hollow, the Chinese Quarter, was also the red light district. But I think we wanted to do it in an elegant way and make it also, the team also wanted to make it into an object which people could interact with, they could sit on. You can see that in the model that we had and went to great trouble to locally source a big piece of granite, because we're on the granite belt, well, not far from the granite belt here in Brisbane. And I wanted to be on the corner, so it was milled on three sides, more or less, to indicate a turning a corner, a new page in our history. But public artworks are organic things, not only because you can see Matteo there applying a patina, so this is living, and it looks it looks different now. It recently had a black patina applied to it, but it hasn't been brought out yet. So I'm not sure how the reaction will be to that. But because you will note that symbol is the Bohemia ex Blakea. And at the time, I created it in homage to Henry Arthur Blake, which that flower was named after. And he was a Queensland governor, although hadn't taken the official post up, but then moved to Hong Kong just as the 99-year lease had been negotiated. So there was that connection there, because the Chinese Quarter is also near the Botanic Gardens and also our Parliament House, but it's also a gateway. Hong Kong was a gateway, I mean, for many travelers, even up until recently, to come to Australia. But the issue that we may see here is also that it takes on a different meaning now. I mean, in terms of things such as the unrest that's happened over there, to have such a strong symbol of that region. So we will have to, I'm not really sure of the future of this artwork. And as an artist, all I can hope for is that there will be some recognition still for that Chinese community that was there in the past. And it doesn't obviously have to be this artwork, will have to be anything to do with me. But it's been a great honor to create it in the first place. So moving on, so you recognize this from Sydney, I hope, that a lot of you may have visited Haymarket and the Dixon Street Mall. So we're sort of moving on from reinstating to reflecting now. And it's an artwork, a structure actually architecturally that's won a lot of design awards. And it was created by a team led by Vincent Frost and Frost Design, Lacoste Stevens Architecture, Axolotl Projects did the glass. And one of the main drivers as well, just like Daniel was at the Brisbane City Council, was the City of Sydney's project manager, Mano Honambalam. And he himself was an award-winning architect and designer who worked with light. So they had this proposition for the pagoda, which had proved problematic for the council because at night people were using it for unsociable behaviour. So they needed to enclose it in some way, and it was for many years used as an information kiosk. And it's really interesting is that I went to this meeting where there must have been at least 30 people debating about how to future-proof this artwork. And yet what no one seemed to have foreseen was that an information kiosk no longer was needed when people have smartphones and they could actually download all the information themselves. So there's present discussions about how this might be revamped into like a dumpling bar, or like somewhere that serves tea drinks would be probably most appropriate. It's very, very exciting, actually, that it might have a new life because Dixon Street Mall is presently being renovated. In terms of the symbolism involved, I was asked to respond primarily to the the agricultural and social history of Haymarket. And so flowers, again, I like flowers, I do. It's a bit of and also they're very significant for paper cutting, but these tea flowers also not only may reflect some produce that was grown and sold, but also the chrysanthemum, but the importation of tea, which is really significant worldwide, but particularly to Sydney. And so I'll give you examples. Wing Sang, this is the Wing Sang building on the far left that was located on the corner of Hay, Quay and Lackey Streets. And so amongst the things that they imported was tea. And the second image that I'm sure you're all familiar with is Kwong Tat. And he introduced casual dining in the 19th century to Australia. And in particular, he offered places for women to congregate outside of their homes. And his tea room was in George Street. So this photo was taken in 1891. The third image, I thought that I'd include also some of the electrical workings of the kiosk are behind the glass that axolotl have annealed with metal, because the other thing that I affiliate with the Chinese community is the importation of mass-produced goods in the 1980s and 90s, right to the 2000s. And when we were designing this kiosk, I can also remember that there was, particularly in Haymarket, you could buy these little accessories as well, sort of little electronic things. So there's a question. Only 3 colors have been used. Why is the banana not colored?
Pamela, you can answer that question after you finish the presentation. No problem.
All right. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
No, I'm very keen to have this dialogue with you. I had told Jing before, I'm not used to speaking at people at all because I haven't been in university. I teach language. We want people to practice speaking, so we're always trying to get everyone to speak. So I apologize for that. So there's, I mentioned before, the difference between government sanctified Chinatowns and infrastructure, and then others driven by commerce, Chinese commerce, and the communities themselves. And this is an example of it's a public artwork that's being created in Melbourne, in Box Hill. So, and it was it's what's called a wing blade, so a wind blade. And in a new building, sometimes they have to stop because the architecture actually can direct the wind and amplify it and make it very uncomfortable for people walking through certain areas. And so quite fortunate for me, Urban Art Projects approached me and said they had this Chinese company wanting to decorate it. And in most cases, I wasn't part a lot of negotiations with this job, so I don't know whether it was because that they had a government requirement to decorate the building, or they simply were interested in art. I can certainly say commercially, I've done a lot of work with Chinese companies and they love art. So they have a real sense of the power of aesthetics. So I'm sorry, I don't have, I'm not aware of that side of the process as to whether or not there was government involvement. But this particular artwork, I wanted to draw attention to why Chinese migrants came to Melbourne in the first place. And although the gold fields were not in close proximity or in this area of Box Hill, I still wanted to make reference to the searching for aluminum gold and the flickering of gold in the water. And quite ironically, I guess, that these days you're more likely to find the flicking of a goldfish than you are of anything of great fiscal value, because apparently they were introduced and in the 1860s and not necessarily by the Chinese community. And why I say that is because that I've read about some shipments, one in particular from Japan that purportedly introduced some unpleasant sort of ailments to the population of goldfish, I mean, rather than people. But for the Chinese, they believe goldfish are a symbol of wealth and prosperity. And I particularly like this artwork because it being on glass, even though it's kind of more orange red than it is gold, it's as though we're looking through water in a fish tank, like a fish tank. So just to show you, sorry, I'm just trying to get this to my this is frozen. There it goes. So other areas of the new Chinatown in Melbourne's Box Hill. So there's a lot of infrastructure going. We don't need to, in this sense, reinstate because it's already there, but we are reflecting in the artwork. And this is an article in the China South China Morning Post, and it actually specifies the intentions of the Golden Age group, where they wanted to facilitate job growth in the local area and accommodate. It's not stated here, but the population, Chinese population of Box Hill is around 46%, so quite high as a settlement in terms of a percentage of settlement. But what's interesting about this article, it then goes on to specify other other percentages in other cities, including Sydney. And I was a little surprised to see then they also mentioned Chatswood, because Chatswood, yeah, I was also unaware of this at the time that they commissioned this artwork. Is also the location of another one of my projects, and it's called Here to Stay, and it was commissioned by Mirvac with the Willoughby City Council, and Axolotl again did the fabrication for it. So you can see that I guess because I wasn't really looking at doing something to appeal to a Chinese community as I did with Box Hill, the language is a little bit different, although there is the reference that this is a copper alloy that's been annealed into glass, into, again, the Foshan paper cutting. But my main reference was actually a 15th century copper plate etching. So around that time as well, they started to do non-ecclesiastic images in books. They printed books that were not to do with the church, but had a lot of plants in them. And so these species, I had the blue flax lily, which is endemic to the area, and also a jasmine flower symbolic of Chinese migration. And the artwork is more or less about peaceful coexistence between the two. So finally, I'm just going to, are we okay for time?
That's all right. I think this is your last slides or something. Yeah, that's finished. That's okay. No problem.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to mention that I won't go into that page, but we're trying to, I did some woodblock prints, and I've been getting the community to print them and then paint, draw calligraphic, do calligraphic Chinese drawings of the crops that they grew. And so they're literally inserting the Chinese farmers back into a cultural landscape, into a landscape. And I found this a really valuable process in terms of engagement. But more or less, that what artists can do is they can address a lack of visual material, but also increase the representation of otherwise underserved communities in the cultural landscape in general. So historically reinstating them. So I'm sorry about going over time.
No, not at all. It's a fascinating. Oh, thank you so much, Pamela. This really interesting. I mean, you have so much to talk about. Before I get to the color question from the audience, which is very interesting, I get to ask the first question is, because at the beginning, you mentioned that initially you resisted a paper cutting, particularly because of this traditional Chinese format or whatever it is. So I want to know, why did you resist paper cutting? And second part of the question is, obviously you get on a paper cutting and being the best paper cutting artist that I've ever seen. So my second part of the question is, did paper cutting lead you to Chinese Australian history, or is actually Chinese Australian history inspires your artistic creation?
Well, I think the answer is really twofold. And firstly, in terms of my rejecting paper cutting, I've been doing paper crafts since about the age of 7 with my family. So that was when I had a relative move from Malaysia, and then there were enough women to get together to make these objects while the men talked business and things like that. And I didn't mean to say that I rejected paper cutting as much as the proposition of doing a European style of paper cutting. I didn't feel it to be comfortable or appropriate, but then I realized that's I think, particularly when you meet the paper cutters from China, they are not concerned about it being directly symbolic of their place of origin. So I thought that maybe it would be okay to, and it's a very useful medium. And insofar as Chinese history, and it's funny because from the beginning, when I was paper cutting, I was really fascinated with, they weren't symbols to me. I just really liked things like cane toads, introduced species, because to the Chinese, they're considered really lucky. but then they inadvertently reflect incidences, if you could say occurrences in history when they were introduced, for instance. So it's mostly because Chinese paper cutting, as you can see, when the communists adopted it, has such strong social capital that it has to be viewed, I think, in this way. At least the way I use it, it has to be considered as a social text, and as such, I need to address the historical context around it. Is that, I hope that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating that the way you answer this, and it is make perfect sense. Color question, I myself actually has the same question or similar question. The question is why have only 3 colors being used, black and white and red? For example, why is a banana not colored yellow?
I wanted to use the color of white. It does symbolize death for the Chinese, but also because it's invisible. So, and in terms of the invisibility of the contribution to the Australian cultural landscape, people didn't always recognize that. The black is symbolic of death, but these silhouettes often are. They've been described historically as these funeral things by a journalist at the turn of the 20th century. So always, and it's about the shadow, about them being an embodiment of the soul. So, and the red is lucky for Chinese, but also those flowers of red, the red silk cotton tree flower.
Yeah, so okay, so we have, before I get on to my question, there is another question from Echo Xiang. I'm Echo, a first-year PhD student from Auckland University of Technology.
Hello.
Yeah, Chinese art.
To have you here.
Chinese art and creative communities are often overlooked and undervalued in New Zealand. In Australia, there is evidence of museums, galleries, and specialist associations that have actively supported Chinese artists and their work, and such is what you are doing right now, the Chinese arts communities, which we still need here in New Zealand. Do you have any suggestions or directions for New Zealand new art graduates and grassroots art communities on founding meaningful ways to make our communities and our artworks more visible and recognized in a colonial country?
Firstly, I'd like to say how sorry I am to hear that you feel underrepresented within the community that you live in. It must make you very uncomfortable, and particularly because a lot of the images that I've been looking at too with the mining, Chinese mining, actually are from New Zealand. So, and I mean, I would have to ask as well, is that also reflect a certain level of how do you go, assimilation and mixing of communities in New Zealand that's different to Australia? It may be different in Australia because, and this is not something that a practitioner would likely be able to address, but we just have such a large Chinese population, and they are, particularly in Sydney, audience as well and consumers of art. So we have curators, people, art administrators that are Chinese. So it just seems just a very natural progression. For myself personally, it's hard for me to recommend this in this age of COVID, because what had made a big difference to me was actually living in China for a number of years and getting out of my mind about simply being Chinese, because we are a heterogeneous community. So within Australia too, I mentioned people who are from Guangdong province or Fujian province, which are 2 of my heritages, but there are many others. But we are very different. We don't even, like Professor Jing and I, we're different kinds of Chinese people. We don't see ourselves as the same united group, yet we support each other, which is really great. So I don't, in short, I'm not really sure. I mean, if you can get together with your colleagues who share the same values, and this is whether you like to differentiate yourself on your cultural background or your gender, whatever that might be, and then work together to develop that mass, you know, so and accumulate resources as well to show. So that would be my advice. But again, a lot of these things in terms of cultural representation are they're very difficult to resolve on your own. I'm sorry about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I get to ask the last question if we don't pop up with one more question from audience. You know, you did a lot of portraits, and during the gold rush, most of Chinese miners are actually males. So in your portraits, because you have one slide about all these portraits, do you have experience of, you know, most of the portraits are male than females?
We deliberately had to seek out examples of women that did migrate in the 19th century, and it was very rare, actually, for them to come and particularly settle here. So, but in my experience, yes, you're correct. The far majority are male.
So that's probably a skewer your skills in a way, because you would have cut more males and then cut females. Do you feel that, or not necessarily?
I have cut more males than I have females, I'm afraid. But I think that historically we do need to recognize certain phenomena. And you might be able to answer this, Jing, as to whether or not they were not allowed to leave, I think, or they simply stayed at home and they had their families back in China. They sent their money back, so they came for a period, and then they, just like the migrant workers today, you know, they're in China. So although their wives do go with them, it's just they didn't. Because a lot of them came on the credit ticket system, so when they came, they were contracted to work in sometimes very difficult conditions for a number of years to pay off that transportation first. So it just, there's so much to go into that question. I mean, in terms of what roles women were allowed to occupy at that time too, in the 19th century and so forth.
Yes, it is. That's why, you know, caught my attention, I'm sure. So as you said, you know, you are acutely aware of that. So yes, so there are fewer females, and because of the first Chinese novel, the Poison of a Polygamy, and that was kind of the first one actually give some prominence to Chinese female when they first migrated to Australia. So prior to that, all the stories in newspapers and all sorts actually seldom mention Chinese females. So that's, yeah, it's very interesting. Last question is not really a question. Someone said, is a statue in my photo, a background photo, is a cutting on metal? Is actually not. I think that one is not it's a more functional pole, but the reason one actually behind me is a sculpture. It's a metal sculpture. So yeah, that's very eagle-eyed. Thank you for that question. So yes, we are a little bit over time, but thank you so much, Pamela. And I actually have more questions, but I will leave it to another time to ask. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk, and for your integration of your art and your research, and you know, really using the kind of ancient, but you contemporize the art, you know, paper cutting, and very much touch on the very present and the current issues, including what is happening in Alice Spring. You know, there was some news and headline news today and yesterday. So I really admire and appreciate your acute awareness as an artist, connecting with social issues, and you are very thoughtful and deep thinking artist. So really appreciate your talk. Thank you so much, Pamela.
I thank you. I'm very grateful to all of you and your patience with me today.
No, you are
Been a real
wonderful.
honor and privilege.
Thank you
I
so
only
much.
wish I could hear from more of all of you there who've been patient
Yes.
attending.
Yeah. Thank you so much, audience, as well. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Pamela. See you another time. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.